From the pulpit of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas, this is Pathway to Victory with Dr. Robert Jeffress.
Hi, I'm Robert Jeffress, and welcome again to Pathway to Victory. To many Christians, persecution is something that happens in far-off places, like Asia or the Middle East. But in reality, persecution is running rampant in America. And while we've been given a reprieve with our current administration, the Bible teaches that hostility toward Christians will one day get even worse. Today, I'm going to offer 3 essential words to help you prepare for what's coming. My message is titled, When Persecution Comes, on today's edition of Pathway to Victory.
Jesus declared, "You are the salt of the earth and the light of the world." With so much darkness creeping into our schools and communities, now is the time to answer that calling. Become the salt and light the world desperately needs through the Pathway to Victory Salt and Light Matching Challenge. Your gift today, doubled in ministry impact, will empower Pathway to Victory to proclaim the gospel and stand for biblical truth. Push back and hold strong against moral decline by joining the Salt and Light Matching Challenge.
Any Christian who seriously takes God's command to be light and salt in this dark and decaying world needs to understand you may not and will not always receive justice, but you always can be guaranteed to receive persecution. Jesus said in John 16:33, "In this world you will have tribulation, but be of good courage, I have overcome the world." The Apostle Paul, who before his conversion had been an instrument of persecution against Christians, almost overnight became a target of persecution. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he details some of the suffering that he experienced as a Christian. He said in 2 Corinthians 11, 24 to 27, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. That was Paul's experience. Or listen to the experience of the first century Christians that followed Paul. As the writer of Hebrews notes, believers were tortured, not accepting their release in order that they might obtain a better resurrection, and others experienced scourgings, yes, chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword, they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. Now, when we read passages like that, let's be honest, we try to assure ourselves that we won't have to go through that kind of suffering because, after all, we live in a different time in history. And yet it's pointed out that more Christians died as martyrs in the 20th century than all the other centuries combined, Christians around the world. The reason we in the West, in America specifically, feel immune from this kind of suffering is we live in a self-made bubble. We're not aware of what is happening to Christians around the world today. For example, since 2003, Iraqi Christians have been frequent targets by Islamic extremists. In Iran, authorities arrested 70 Christians over a 6-week period of time in an effort to target grassroots Christian groups. In January of 2011, a judge in Afghanistan told Shaib Azadullah that if he did not renounce Christ, within 1 week he would face up to 20 years in prison or even be sentenced to death. Today, more Christians are imprisoned in China than in any other country in the world. Hundreds of thousands of believers are detained in work camps each year without even a court order so that they can participate in a re-education through labor program, as the Chinese like to call it. The only legal churches allowed by the Chinese government are those controlled by the government. Those who meet in house churches not sanctioned by the government risk torture, imprisonment, and death. Philip Yancey describes a visit with Pastor Alan Wan, who helped to found the house church movement in China during the Japanese occupation. Pastor Wan was 90 years old at the time of his interview. He had spent 22 years in prison. He had been tortured and spent months in solitary confinement in a windowless cell. Listen to what he said to Philip Yancey. He said, "I pulled blankets over my head and prayed. For 10 years, no letters from my family got through. I had no Bible, but a few passages and Psalms stayed with me." Wan spent 13 years of his sentence in China's most northern province. He said, "It was a miracle. I had only a light jacket, and in the freezing winter weather, I never caught a cold or the flu, not sick a single day." Pastor Wan is convinced that persecution for Christians is not only inevitable, but profitable for believers. Listen to what this pastor said. He said, "We live in a time like the apostles. Christians are persecuted, yes, but look at the Hong Kong and Taiwan church. They have prosperity, but they don't seek God. I tell you, I came out of that prison with faith stronger than I went in. Like Joseph, we don't know why we go through hard times until later looking back. Think of it. We in China may soon have the largest Christian community in the world and in an atheistic state that tried to stamp us out." Christians experienced intense sufferings in the first century. They are now experiencing suffering around the world. The Bible also predicts that in the final years before Christ's return, Christians will also experience unprecedented hardship. The Apostle John describes a large group of believers who will be slain during the tribulation. In Revelation 6:9, he says, "And when he broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony that they had maintained." Of course, the instigator of this persecution will be the Antichrist. In Revelation 13:7, John says, "And it was given to him, the Antichrist, to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him." The special target of Antichrist persecution will be Christians. What way will Antichrist make war with God's people? One way he will do so is by restricting the purchase of necessary goods and services for survival to those who agree to worship him. David Jeremiah envisions the possibility of long lines of Christians waiting in the supermarket to purchase food and praying for a miracle that scanner will somehow not notice that they do not possess the required identification. Now, such a thought is not just fanciful imagination. It is guaranteed reality if you take seriously the revelation from John. There is coming a time of great, intense persecution. Now, obviously, there is a spectrum of persecution that people experience. That spectrum can range from not being invited to a dinner party because you're too opinionated, all the way to being tortured and even executed because you don't recant your faith. There is a spectrum of persecution. And I want to suggest to you tonight that the degree to which you as a Christian will experience persecution is dependent upon two factors. First of all, the intensity of your conviction will determine the intensity of the persecution you face. Let me say it again. The intensity of your conviction will determine the intensity of the persecution you face. The pastor who never preaches against homosexuality or abortion or talks about the exclusivity of the gospel will never face ridicule from the media. The Christian student who refuses to challenge his non-Christian professor's erroneous teaching will never have to worry about a lowered grade. A believer who decides not to offend his non-Christian parents by sharing the gospel with them will never risk experiencing their disapproval. The intensity of your conviction will determine the intensity of the persecution you experience. Secondly, the extent of the persecution you face is determined by the spiritual climate of the culture in which you live. The extent of the persecution you face is also determined by the spiritual climate of the culture in which you live. We have become increasingly hostile toward Christianity in our country. Now, secularists would attribute that change to our nation's collective open-mindedness and tolerance. They would say, we now are much more sophisticated than earlier generations. We recognize that there are multiple paths to God, and no one religion can claim exclusivity. Biblicists would say, no, it is Romans chapter 1 in action. Because our nation has rejected the truth of God, we have fallen into a time of darkening in our understanding. But regardless of the reason, I think even the most casual observer realizes that our culture is more hostile toward Christianity than at any other time in our nation's history. And realizing that that negativity and hostility is more likely to increase than it is to subside means we ought to get ready for persecution. Well, how should we respond to the escalating attacks against Christians? How do we get ready for persecution? In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, the writer says, we ought to encourage one another, and all the more as we see the day drawing near. Now, one way we can encourage one another as Christians is to help prepare one another for this inevitable time of persecution. And that's what I want to do in these moments tonight. Tonight, I want to share with you 3 words that I believe are essential in strengthening yourself and preparing for the coming persecution that every genuine follower of Christ will experience. The first word, and write it down, is the word certain. Suffering is certain. The first recorded case of persecution against Christians as a whole occurred under Emperor Nero in 64 AD. On the night of June 18th, a great fire erupted in Rome, destroying 10 of the 14 sections of the city. Many believe that Nero himself set the fires. But to deflect blame from himself, he blamed Christians. And he was able to devise the most heinous tortures imaginable for believers. One thing he would do would be to take Christians while they were alive, immerse them in wax, and then set them on fire to serve as human torches to illuminate his gardens. However, as in our culture, this awful persecution against Christians didn't happen suddenly. Instead, it happened progressively. Nero was allowed by the population to commit these atrocities against Christians because, as the historian Tacitus notes, Christians were already a class hated for the abominations by the populace. And you know, I believe in our culture you see this growing hatred toward Christians that is festering and is being fueled by the media by using these stereotypes of what Christians are. Just watch the media. Notice how any evangelical Christian in a sitcom or a movie is portrayed. And it is this growing animosity toward believers that is going to pave the way for a general acceptance in our culture of the persecution against Christians. Most scholars agree that the Apostle Peter wrote his letter 1 year before Nero began his empire-wide persecution of believers. But listen to what Peter said in 1 Peter 4, verses 12 to 13. He said, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that at the revelation of His glory, you may rejoice with exultation." Do not be surprised, Peter says. You know, when hit with hardships, many Christians appear dazed and confused. They walk around in a spiritual stupor, wondering, what's wrong? Why is this happening to me? They are shocked that obeying Christ has resulted in an alienation from friends, or a loss of a job, or even the breakup of a marriage. The truth is, we ought to be more surprised if we're not suffering for our faith. See, Peter says persecution is the rule rather than the exception for those who have chosen to follow Christ. Beyond being surprised, many Christians get disillusioned with a God who would allow them to suffer for doing not the wrong thing, but for doing the right thing. And yet, all you have to do is look at how God dealt with his own Son, his beloved Son, to get a different perspective on persecution. You see, suffering is not an unexpected detour in God's plan for your life. It is actually a part of God's calling for your life. Why would God not only plan for his Son as well as for you and me to suffer? That leads to the second word that would encourage you in times of suffering. Suffering is not only certain, but suffering is profitable. While suffering results in some temporary discomfort, the long-term gain far exceeds the short-term losses. In fact, on a personal level, it is the heat of persecution that fortifies our faith. Remember what James said in James 1, verses 2 to 4? He was talking to a group of Hebrew Christians who were suffering. They were being dispersed throughout the Roman Empire because of their faith. And James said, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Now that word testing, the testing of your faith, literally means approved. It is a word that was used to describe the process by which a potter would take a clay pot and he would place it in a firing oven in order to fortify that piece of sculpture, that clay pot. And the potter's purpose in putting his work of art into that firing oven was not to destroy it, but to strengthen it. And if it survived that fire without cracking, the word was written on the bottom, this Greek word that is translated tested or approved. Now that is the same word that James uses to describe God's reason for putting you through the oven of testing, so that your faith can be strengthened. God's purpose is not to destroy you, but to strengthen your faith. Persecution, testing is not only profitable for us personally, but also for the church as a whole. Even the most cursory study of history reveals that persecution causes the church to flourish, to expand, while prosperity causes the church to wither away and retreat. Later in his life, Peter looked back and saw the connection between persecution and the growth of the church. He said in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, "But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to anyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence." You know, we always take this verse out of context. We think it's a verse for apologetics. We kind of say, well, now, you know, if you're walking down the street, be prepared to give people an answer for why you believe in the virgin birth of Christ, or why you believe in the second coming of Jesus. Have all of these facts, because somebody may ask you why you believe these things. Baloney. The world we live in today, nobody could care less about those things. They're not interested in those things. Peter is saying what causes people to ask you for the hope that is within you is when they see you responding positively to suffering. He said, when people see you responding positively to suffering, be ready to give an answer, because people are going to ask you, how do you do that? How do you react that way when the world around you is collapsing? It's always been that way. The suffering of Christians is the seed for Christianity. Persecution against Christians is certain. It is profitable both personally and for the movement as a whole. Thirdly, suffering is temporary. And that's perhaps the most encouraging word about suffering. It's temporary. You know, that's the only comfort sometimes we find in suffering, that as bad as it is temporary. The Apostle Peter was writing to Christians who were imprisoned. Others had lost their jobs, their homes, their livelihood. Some were having to choose between their faith and their families, and some were beginning to be executed for their faith. Listen to what Peter said. He never tried to diminish the reality of the pain they were facing. but he encouraged them with one small phrase. In 1 Peter 3:6, Peter writes, "In this you greatly rejoice, even though for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials." For a little while. Those are perhaps the most encouraging words to anyone who is suffering, especially suffering because of his commitment to Christ. It's as if Peter is saying, I know this is hurtful. I know this is hard, but the pain you feel will not last forever. Of course, the question is, how little is little? Well, you see, time is a matter of perspective, and suffering is a matter of perspective. Remember a few moments ago we looked in 2 Corinthians 11 at the catalog of Paul's sufferings, beaten 5 times within an inch of his life, shipwrecked, tortured, and so forth and so forth. And yet listen in 2 Corinthians 5 as he describes those sufferings. He writes in verses 17 to 18, "For a momentary light affliction is producing in us an eternal weight of glory far beyond our comparison, while we look at not things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal." Look at all that Paul went through, and yet he described them as momentary light afflictions, as if they were nothing more than getting stuck in the slow line at the supermarket. Paul's not diminishing the pain he felt or the pain you feel as well. But he said, compared to the eternal weight of God's unending rewards, what we suffer in this life is both momentary and it is light. It's nothing when you compare it to the weight of God's blessings that will be ours forever and ever. As St. Teresa famously said one time, "In light of heaven, the worst suffering on earth, a life full of the most atrocious tortures on earth, will be seen to be no more serious than a one-night stay in an inconvenient hotel." We hope we never have to make the choice between faithfulness to Christ and painful persecution. But the stories of Christians around the world and in history tell us that we are not going to be exempt from making those kind of choices. You know, I'll have to confess to you that when I read the stories of Christians in past ages, the great martyrs of the faith, I really am fearful that I won't have the same response they did. Sometimes I wonder, do they just simply have a greater threshold for pain than I have? But as I read their stories more carefully, I discover that is not the difference between them and us. It's not that they had a greater threshold for pain. It's that they had a different perspective. They thoughtfully weighed the temporary, real pain of persecution against the eternal, unending rewards of God. And using that scale, the choice was not difficult to make at all. And neither will it be for most of you when persecution comes. We do a disservice to our church members and all those who claim Jesus as Lord to present anything other than the truth. The Bible has made it very clear that persecution is coming, and Christian believers need to be prepared. In the time remaining today, I want to tell you that our Salt and Light Matching Challenge launched earlier this week. As you give between now and July 6th, any gift you give will be matched and therefore doubled in impact until we reach the finish line. In Matthew 5, Jesus declared, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world." He didn't say you should be or that you ought to be. He said, "You are." Right now. And that's exactly what we're doing together through this broadcast ministry of Pathway to Victory. So please join me in seizing this opportunity to push back against the moral decline in our nation and expand our influence for the gospel across America and around the world. Now stay right there. I'll be back with more in just a moment.
The moral decline in today's world can feel overwhelming. But God calls us to shine His light and make a difference for Him in a world that has lost its way. In his brand new book, Shine the Light, Dr. Robert Jeffress shows you how small, faithful acts like teaching, serving, and encouraging can restore and renew Christian values in your family, your church, and community.
The Bible teaches that our primary purpose in life is to influence the world with the gospel. And in my new book, I'll show you how to live purposefully and leave behind a legacy of faith, wisdom, and compassion.
The world may seem lost, but God's light has not dimmed, and neither has yours. Request your copy of Shine the Light when you give a generous gift to the Pathway to Victory Salt and Light Matching Challenge. And when your ministry gift is $100 or more, we'll also send you the complete Shine the Light teaching series on DVD and audio disc.
Light is of little value in the light. If we're going to be effective, we're effective for Christ not when we're around other light sources, other Christians. It is when we are in the darkness. Light has to confront the darkness.
Remember, your gift today will have twice the impact thanks to the Pathway to Victory Salt and Light Matching Challenge. Thank you for partnering with Pathway to Victory as we boldly proclaim the gospel and equip believers to shine God's light in a world that has lost its way. I think even the most casual observer realizes that our culture is more hostile toward Christianity than at any other time in our nation's history. And because the negativity and hostility are likely to increase, we ought to get ready for coming persecution. Well, even though the prophet Elijah was a man of God, he cared deeply about what was happening in his world. And we ought to have the same passion that Elijah had for influencing the people and nations around us. Stay tuned for a preview of what's coming up next in our series, Shine the Light. You know, some people actually believe that God has no interest in what is happening in the world. And yet, from the very beginning, God gave man the mandate to take care of the world in which He placed him. God's interest, listen to this, God's interest extend beyond the four walls of the church. God is not only interested in religious institutions, He's interested in the whole world. Set your DVR and join us next time for the message, Determined to Influence Your Culture, here on Pathway to Victory.